Today we're going to be looking at another one of Brew's videos. Specifically, he lived inside a dead body. His family watched for 83 days, depicting what happened after one of the most infamous nuclear accidents. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Tyler Fultz. I'm a nuclear engineer, a little over 10 years of experience in the commercial nuclear power industry, from engineering to operations to emergency response. I don't claim to know everything there is nuclear, but I can certainly share some knowledge. Let's check this out.
This video is sponsored by Klima. After an accident at work, a man was transported to the hospital for severe radiation poisoning. He recalled seeing a blue flash and throwing up immediately afterward. At first, medical staff believed he was fine.
Is referring to a criticality accident, similar to that of the infamous Demon Core. If you haven't seen my reaction to that accident, I'll put a link down below. I highly encourage you to check that one out.
Even thought he would be well enough to leave the hospital. Despite his outward appearance, the man's body was slowly changing, pushing doctors to apply a number of experimental procedures to save what was left of him. The human body is perhaps the most complex machine on Earth. An urban myth says that your cells replace themselves every 7 years, leaving behind the old you for a completely new person. Although we're capable of healing ourselves to a certain extent, this is not completely true. What would happen if we lost the ability to
By the way, yes, I have heard of that 7 myth, but it all depends on the body. Skin cells get replaced pretty quickly every 2 to 4 weeks, and some gut cells even on the order of days. But then you have neurons and heart muscle cells that don't get replaced.
Generate cells? And how much time would we have before our body is no longer considered alive? This is the story of Hisashi Ouchi, the most irradiated man in history, his family who couldn't let him go, and his 3-month-long battle for survival in a body falling apart at the seams.
Quite a horrific story. For those of you that have been followers of my channel for a while, I did a reaction to this topic before, but I think that video is in dire need of update, not to mention it ran into a few copyright issues. I like that his channel's called Brew and he's making some type of brew of radioactive material. Disclaimer, speak with experts. Well, I'll give this my expert thought, though again, my own disclaimer is my knowledge is far from exhaustive in nuclear or anything for that matter.
And with that out of the way, let's get into it. Nuclear energy is one of the ways for us as a species to wean off fossil fuels. And nowadays, reducing our carbon footprint.
Well said. Nuclear can supply the baseload requirements that coal and natural gas provide. Hydro can also supply baseload. I've gotten a few comments that I often leave out hydro, so I appreciate that. Though I will say hydro is a bit more limited on geographical features, kind of like geothermal as well.
The Tokimura nuclear plant was commissioned in 1988 in the small Japanese fishing village of Tokai. It was operated by JCO, formerly known as the Japan Nuclear Fuel Conversion Company, established in 1979.
When they say fuel conversion, they're talking about enrichment. That is to say, taking natural uranium and enriching it to a concentration that can be used effectively in nuclear power plants. Because natural uranium has less than 1% uranium-235, which is the active ingredient that causes fusion, that causes fission. But fuel assemblies in a nuclear power plant have enrichments of 3 to 5%. And for comparison, nuclear weapons that utilize uranium-235 have upwards of 90%.
For 10 years, the nuclear plant supplied sundry research and experimental reactors for the
I like these minuscule little cooling towers. They're cute.
Japanese scientific community, part of the actual energy grid. The plant produced up to 3 tons of enriched uranium per year up until the accident in September 1999.
For the record, this is an artist illustration. Nuclear fuel doesn't have green glowy sludge in it.
Workers would dissolve uranium oxide powder using nitric acid in a dissolution tank, then pump the resulting substance, now called uranyl nitrate, into a storage column built with specific reaction-preventing geometry for mixing. Then, workers would pump the no-exothermically reacting uranyl nitrate into a precipitation tank surrounded by water
Gotta
to
love
cool
the
it
green
off,
stuff,
keeping
though.
it from hitting critical mass. However, a measly 3 years prior, in 1996, the company's standards had been changed without the express clearance of the Japanese Energy Authority, a change that would have a significant impact on the workers tasked to mix the nuclear material.
Now that is crazy. Though I will admit it's crazy looking from someone that worked in the industry in the 2010s and 2020s, and I was just a kid in the 90s, so I don't have firsthand knowledge of how change control procedures were done. Also, I worked in the US and not Japan. But for a change like that to occur today requires independent screening from site engineers in addition to their quality assurance team to see if you should even attempt something like this without prior regulatory approval. And there are situations where you would, but that's if the change is in the conservative direction. That is to say, additional barriers put in place, additional radiation safety protocols put in place. If it does things that are non-conservative or could potentially have an adverse impact on safety, the appropriate regulatory authorities need to be involved. But a lot of times, if something looks like it's heading in that direction, the change just simply won't get implemented. But I suppose this is a different world.
Instead of dissolving the uranium oxide in the dissolution tank, workers were to just do it in stainless steel buckets to speed up the process. In addition to that, it was
Okay, yeah, and this is in the non-conservative adverse direction.
modified further, trading safety for speed by pouring the uranyl nitrate directly into the precipitation tank.
So even with this, I mean, the drawing is clearly done to make light of the situation, but there would still be personal protective equipment requirements, chemical safety, goggles, gloves, lab coat, things of that nature that you would for any sort of chemical mixing, chemical synthesis reaction procedure. The difference involved here, though, is you're dealing with nuclear material, special nuclear material. That's actually what it's called. That will eventually turn into nuclear fuel. So subcriticality margin, or how far you are away from turning this thing into a reactor, needs to be taken into consideration. Just like it is at the other end of the fuel cycle, such as placing fuel in the spent fuel pool and in dry cask storage.
Instead of mixing the substance in the storage column, it would happen in the precipitation tank instead, bypassing the systems intended to prevent criticality.
Criticality meaning a self-sustaining nuclear fission reaction. Misconception is that criticality means something is going to explode. That's not the case. In other words, a nuclear reactor. And enrichment facilities are not designed to have nuclear reactors, especially one that you hold in your hand.
Put simply, workers were asked to ignore the first and second tanks, the ones made specifically to prevent accidents, dissolve the uranium by hand, and then pour it into the final tank like it was a uranium latte.
I like the little tardigrade logo. Yeah, that's so many safety barriers were defeated. And where's the plant's internal oversight committee in this? They not have one, or did they just not care? Or maybe things are done differently, or were done differently in Japan in the 90s. But things like this should be quashed way before the regulatory body even has to step in. And of course, at this point, they didn't even make any notifications.
Sounds safe, doesn't it? On the morning of the 30th of September, 1999, nuclear workers Hisashi Ouchi and Masato Shinohara were mixing up a batch of fuel, while their supervisor, Yutaka
It might as well have just been using a barrel and a stick.
Yokogawa sat at his desk about 4 meters away. Ouchi and Shinohara were supposed to mix up 2.4 kilos of enriched uranium. But instead, they were manually mixing up 16 kilos of the nuclear substance in the aforementioned steel buckets. This was, as we mentioned before, wildly dangerous. Then, at 10...
So just to add even more nuclear fuel to this fire, they are departing from their non-conservative procedure. So nuclear procedures have such an immense amount of conservatism built into them. Like spent fuel pool criticality, for instance. The required concentration of boric acid per technical specifications at the plant I worked at. Take, for example, the required concentration of boric acid per a site's technical specification. Let's say it's 2,500 parts per million. The operating procedure has it above 2,800 parts per million. Why boric acid is important is it is a liquefied version of control rods as far as what it does to nuclear fuel. The boron atoms absorb neutrons instead of the uranium, shutting down any fission reactions that would occur. And keep in mind, in the spent fuel pool example, actual criticality would occur at some number well below 1,000 parts per million. But to be absolutely sure, 2,800. So in this case, but here, that's basically the equivalent of an airline removing all of the seats and seat belts for passengers and saying, we're going to accelerate and decelerate 20 times faster and see what happens.
35 a.m., a blue flash erupted from the middle of the room, and all three men were overcome in a wave of nausea.
Not quite as quickly as this graphic would depict, but you see that blue glow? And you're that close to the source, you're not going to make it. That blue glow is Cherenkov radiation, which is what happens when particles travel faster than light. Now, going faster than the speed of light in a vacuum, or c, is impossible. But water, which this would be in some sort of aqueous solution, the speed of light is slowed down to a little over 2/3 of c. But particles from said reaction, some particles from said reaction go between 2/3 C and C. So yes, you can actually break the light barrier. Though, what kills them is a high neutron dose. The dose from neutrons, depending on if they're fast or slow neutrons, can be between 5, which in a reaction like this you'd have both, would be between 5 and 20 times worse than, say, gamma radiation, as far as what they do to the human body. And that blue glow, so they essentially made a reactor for a tiny fraction of a second, but it was enough to give them a lethal dose. Because you're going from microwatts to megawatts in a couple of shakes, a shake being 10 nanoseconds. So the two guys standing next to it absorbed a lot of dose. So did the supervisor, back away from them, and probably a lot of other people and I'm assuming a lot of other people in the building got elevated, but not necessarily, got elevated doses, though not necessarily lethal ones. Because you double your distance from the source, intensity goes down by a factor of 4.
The flash was what's called Cherenkov radiation, which is light that is emitted when electrically charged particles pass through a medium faster than light can. In this case, the water in the precipitation tank slowed down light, but not the now reactive uranium particles. Then, suddenly...
He was right when he said charge, so technically not the uranium. It would be electrons. It would be high-speed electrons.
Flash, followed by a wave of gamma radiation.
Gammas would also be present, though particle for particle, the neutrons are more damaging to humans.
Their coworkers quickly jumped into action, donning hazardous material suits before bolting into the room to rescue the three men and rush them to a local hospital. There, they determined the levels of radiation that each of the men were exposed to. Sieverts are used to measure the impact of low levels of radiation on the human body.
I've never seen it spelled SEI. Must be a regional thing.
For reference, the tip...
Though that is an accurate definition, same biological effect as 1 joule of X-rays per kilogram. So gammas are 1-to-1 with X-rays in most cases. Thermal neutrons are 5 times, and fast neutrons can be as high as 20 times, depending on how fast. An example of Chernobyl workers who died within a month of exposure got upwards of 6 sieverts. True, some of them got even more than that, but 6 sieverts in most situations is likely to kill you. Though not certain, depending on your level of medical treatment you can get.
The dosage of radiation that Chernobyl workers who died within a month of exposure was 6 sieverts, while the highest non-lethal exposure is about 1 sievert.
That's not true. 4 to 6 sieverts, especially with medical treatment, you're looking at an LD 50-60, that's 50% of the population dead within 60 days. 1 sievert will get you sick, but not likely to kill you. 2 is extremely severe, and death is possible, but in most cases, survival is more likely than not. Keep in mind, this is whole body dose, not dose to a specific organ. For instance, 2 sieverts in a very precise dose treats cancer. Is a form of radiation therapy is a radiation therapy dose that can treat cancer. But here we're talking a whole body dose. 10 and upwards of 10 sieverts, death is all but guaranteed. The other thing is these are acute doses or doses that are required all at once, not cumulative dose over the course of years.
Yokokawa, Owuchi's supervisor, received the least at 3 sieverts.
Because he's the supervisor, standing furthest away from the actual source. Though 3 sieverts is still gonna get him sick, and I can only imagine the emotional trauma of having your employees, people that you are responsible for taking care of and ensuring they go home safely, get doses that were even worse.
Nohara received 10 sieverts, and Owuchi received the most, a whopping 17 sieverts.
I know this is an illustration, but he's showing something that registers in counts per second. That is dose rate. So that device would not actually be used to measure integrated dose. That would be a dosimeter that measures your cumulative dose. You may have seen people at hospitals that wear something like this. You can also wear one that shows the dose rate in the area, but ultimately it measures how much dose you got. Every radiological worker is required to wear something like that when they're in a radiological controlled area.
Soon after arriving at a local hospital, medical staff decided that they were ill-equipped to help Owuchi, transferring him to the Tokyo University Hospital, where more experimental methods could be attempted. Dr. Maikawa, the lead doctor in Owuchi's
This is well beyond the threshold for lethal dose.
case, heard about the accident on the news in the afternoon of the first day, and was selected for the role because of his expertise in emergency radiation medicine. He said in an interview that he noticed the staff of the NIRS, National Institute of Radiological Sciences, wore protective suits and masks. Therefore, I suspected the degree of the contamination might have been quite high.
As far as contamination, unless he got the mixture on him, he's not really contaminated. He's just received a very large dose, though they would have wanted to go through precautions just in case he was contaminated.
Maikawa noted that the amount of radiation that Owuchi was exposed to was definitely fatal, but when Owuchi met the team, he actually looked fine. He was able to speak and respond to the medical staff. One nurse tending to
It's a slow, painful way.
Owuchi said that his skin was
What's almost paradoxical is you could get much higher doses and the radiation could kill you faster, much faster than 83 days. But as we're going to find out, he's going to have a much more painful experience than even that way of going. Either way, this is one of the most horrible ways to go.
as if he had got a terrible sunburn. His arm was badly swollen, and he said he had a pain in that area. And another said that she thought that he would be well enough to leave the hospital.
He probably got targeted dose to his arm based on where his arm was relative to the source, the criticality accident.
Despite this, the radiation began penetrating the chromosomes of his cells. Chromosomes contain the blueprints of our genetic information. They provide the code that tells our cells when and how to reproduce. However, now that Owuchi's cells were being destroyed by radiation exposure, his chromosomes were likewise damaged until they could no longer reproduce.
This is such a high dose. I mean, this is how radiation therapy works. It kills cancer cells, but this was an aggregate whole body lethal dose. So it's doing what radiation therapy does to cancer cells to his entire body.
sign of chromosome destruction appeared in his blood. His white blood cell numbers were dropping drastically. Now, something as little as the common cold could spell disaster.
Radiation affects fast-dividing cells the worst, so white blood cells, reproductive cells, those get affected the most, at least immediately.
He was quickly moved to a sterilized room, where he would lie alone for weeks to make sure that didn't happen. And Dr. Maekawa and his team began searching for a possible cell donor that could give Ouchi's body the ability to produce its own white blood cells once more. Almost miraculously, one of Ouchi's siblings was that donor. Dr. Maekawa and his team collected her blood.
This is all going to turn into be a very cruel miracle.
Then extracted their blood stem cells over the course of 9 hours for 2 days straight. Her cells were then transplanted into Ouchi with hopes that his body would accept them and produce white blood cells once again to improve his immune response. It took 10 days to discover if the procedure worked. In that time, he was able to speak to his loved ones and familiarize himself with the nurses tending to him. One nurse asked him how he met his wife.
This is so sad, even looking at little cartoon renditions of the accident.
He told me that they had known each other since high school and they had married after about 7 years. Later, she remarked that she was impressed by his story and told him, "You married with a passionate love." The radiation started to show itself on the surface of Ouchi's body. Another nurse, describing how they adhered to gauze, IVs, and other medical equipment, remarked that it became more and more frequent that his skin was ripped off along with the removed tape.
Skin cells also relatively fast, badly affected, and not to mention closest proximity to the source.
Actually, we couldn't use surgical tape anymore. There is a photograph that nearly all sources for this story use claiming to be Ouchi in the hospital. This is not Ouchi. It's nearly impossible to find the original image, but it is not Ouchi. The man in this photo has had his right foot amputated, and Ouchi did not. At the same time, Dr. Maekawa was trying to convey just how dire Ouchi's situation was to his grieving family. He said, "His appearance was changing drastically, so I had his family see his condition in order for them to accept the truth. Ouchi's lungs began retaining fluids, making his breathing difficult to the point that medical staff considered putting him on a ventilator. This would mean he would..."
This is so sad. One of the things that's regularly reinforced through any sort of safety training, whether it be radiological safety, electrical safety, or a more general industrial safety, is especially for managers, is to have your employees return home in the same condition they came into work. Ideally, a better condition, that maybe, with some satisfaction of a job well done. But I couldn't imagine being either of these guys' supervisor and having to explain what happened to the family, or in this case, I couldn't, because the supervisor was also suffered acute radiation poisoning, just a less lethal version.
Be able to speak to his family. At the time, staff noted Ouchi's words, things like, "I can't stand it," and "I want to go home." He even cried out for his mother. One nurse said later that seeing that kind of scene made our hearts ache.
Yeah.
It was true that nobody knew for sure what would happen to him, but we were...
Yeah, even for medical staff that are used to people getting horrifically injured, this was, I can only imagine. Not even going to try to empathize.
Able to imagine that his condition would get worse and worse. Soon after, Dr. Maekawa was forced to put Ouchi on a ventilator. He wasn't breathing, so they inserted a tube into his windpipe. But despite this, Ouchi's family still visited him every day. A common practice in Japanese culture, senbazuru, the act of folding 1,000 origami cranes, is thought to provide good health to the seriously ill. Since Ouchi's white blood cell count was so low, they couldn't bring any of the cranes into his room. But they folded them all the same.
Put him out,
10 days had passed since Ouchi's blood transfusion, and his blood was tested to see if his siblings' white blood cells had successfully implanted in his body. Peering into a microscope, Dr. Maekawa spotted 2 red dots in one of his blood cells. The chromosomes had survived. It was the first time that white blood cells producers had been successfully implanted into a victim of radiation. His white blood cell count was...
certainly a medical achievement, but this only serves to protract his suffering.
Increasing back to normal levels. He was still intubated, so he couldn't speak. But
It's more than just red blood cells. The damage is so extensive to really all cells. If this had been a lower dose absorbed, this could alleviate some, like a lower acute radiation poisoning. I don't think there's actually a word for that, but this is just too much dose.
was able to respond to his family's calls with gestures. A week later, however, small mutations were discovered in his blood. The chromosomes that Dr. Maekawa had implanted in Ouchi were damaged. Doctors believe that the radiation in his body was so intense, some cells mutated harshly, causing his own cells to emit radiation on their own. Ouchi's worsening condition.
As far as cells emitting radiation, the closest part to truth to that would be some of his tissue, and it's mainly going to be like minerals in his bone, may have gotten activated. And by activation, I'm referring to when a neutron bombards something, and that's when a stable isotope absorbs a neutron, and then it becomes a radioactive isotope. For instance, in the human body, calcium-40 is stable, absorbs a neutron, becomes calcium-41, which is radioactive. As far as the blood goes, sodium-23 can absorb a neutron and become sodium-24. That has a half-life of about 15 hours. So there's not that much of it in the blood. I would think by comparison, the skeletal system would be more affected by neutron activation.
Was not limited to just his skin and blood. The cells walling his intestines began to die as well, and without the ability to replace them, it would only be a matter of time until the bacteria in his guts made their way into his bloodstream, threatening sepsis.
Plus, without a digestive system split like that, you're going to have all kinds of blood loss and just digestive disruption problems, exposure of stool and fecal matter to internal systems. Yeah, that's not survivable.
In the weeks following this development, the amount of diarrhea Ouchi produced increased every day, up to 3 liters per day. His intestines began bleeding, filling his stool with blood. In fact, he was losing so much blood that there were days where he received more than 10 blood
This is nauseating to watch at this point.
transfusions in half a day. Ouchi was moved to a bed that could tilt, made for critically ill patients to aid his circulation. His body was covered almost entirely with gauze, and his eyes began bleeding. Another nurse described his condition at the time, saying that there was a lot of exudate in his skin. It took almost half a day to treat it. Exudate meaning body weeping, aka his body was seeping moisture. Ouchi was also given a ton of narcotics to help.
It's essentially rotting while living in it, hence the term for the title of this video.
Manage his pain, but despite that, he still looked like he was suffering terribly. At this point,
no delivery system. It's been compromised, so the medication's not going to help him very much.
Ouchi was losing around 10 liters of water a day, just through his skin and intestines. So it became imperative that they replenish the same amount of water each day. With the level of devastation, the only option left was a skin transplant. Medical staff cultivated skin cells in vitro, then grafted it to his body. However, Dr. Maekawa noted that the cultured skin didn't adhere to his body because of his deteriorating condition.
It's so deep it affects everything. What skin is used to attach to, just I don't know how many layers, if this is just epidermis and dermis, so I guess it would just be muscle tissue that's underneath was also degrading, that it just wouldn't respond to the transplant.
While it was obvious that Ouchi's chances were slim, according to another member of the team, if somebody had said that aloud, if somebody had had doubts about the active intervention in his life and the doubts had spread across the team, we would have lost sight of our purpose. What the hell are we doing? For whom? For what? I guess we were afraid of having that kind of thought. Another nurse added, I couldn't endure doing the treatment if I hadn't had the conviction I was doing it to protect his life. Almost 2 months had passed since the incident, and after the
There's protecting your life versus the do no harm. I'm not a doctor. I don't know where this sort of decision would fall under the Hippocratic Oath versus, the needs and wants of him, his family. I'm not even gonna speculate on that, but it's just horrible.
Massive blood loss and amount of transfusions, his heart was beating at a blistering 120 beats per minute constantly, about twice as fast as a resting heart rate. It was as if he was running a marathon all day, every day. One morning, Dr. Maikawa was doing his rounds when he saw it. A monitor displaying Owuchi's condition showed that his heart had stopped. Dr. Maikawa bolted to Owuchi's room to start CPR.
And of course, at this point, since they're all still trying, there's not going to be a do not resuscitate order for someone that's even this far gone.
By the end of the day, Owuchi's heart had stopped and started 3 times. He was still alive, but the effects of his multiple heart failures were taking their toll on the rest of his body.
Radiation damaged the heart too. It affected everything. This was a very high dose.
He was no longer conscious enough to respond. Dr. Maikawa said, "Some of the staff members, including me, had a feeling that we shouldn't continue the treatment anymore." However, Mr. Owuchi's family didn't give up hope for his recovery until the very end. Beside his medical bed, his mother called out for him, "Hisashi, hold on," while his father leaned in close to give him some words of encouragement. Never give up. But things were only going to get worse. His immune cells malfunctioned and began attacking his own body. He needed to undergo even more blood transfusions to keep his body from tearing itself apart. Dr. Maikawa admitted that
at this point.
There were no workable solutions.
Long before this point.
My honest feeling was that we were in a complete deadlock. On the 81st day after the accident at Tokimura, well into December, Dr. Maikawa called Owuchi's family together and recommended that if his heart stopped beating again, they should not attempt to resuscitate him. They agreed. So Dr. Maikawa gave his medical...
Still, after that long odyssey, how heartbreaking it is for his family at that
team the do not resuscitate order.
Please.
The following day, Owuchi's wife had a chance to speak with him. She dropped off another batch of paper cranes, which now outnumbered just short of 10,000, and said she wanted to ring in the new year with him. 2 days later, Owuchi's wife returned along with their son. This was the first time in a long time they'd been able to see Owuchi without bandages covering his face. His son, who was in elementary school, said, with hope in his heart, "Dad, hang in there." A nurse who was in the room said that this was the first time she'd seen his wife cry. As far as I could see, that was the only time she cried. Apparently, she was trying to suppress a cry. I thought she didn't have to do that. Later that evening, on the 21st of December, 1999, Owuchi passed away. Dr. Maikawa, upon reaching retirement age in the spring of 2000, retired from his work in hospitals. This case made me painfully aware that the system made by human beings could cause terrible disasters with one wrong move. There is nothing mere doctors like us can do about that. With any latest technology and equipment, we have no chance against the catastrophic effects of radiation. We learned that the hard way.
In this case, yes.
Moving forward, Dr. Maikawa worked on establishing medical procedures for the treatment of radiation exposure. People who passed away will never come back again. There will be no next time for them. The Tokimura nuclear accident was the most severe nuclear accident in Japanese history.
That does actually include Fukushima in terms of deaths, because here we had 2 deaths. Fukushima had 1 death as a result of radiation exposure. There were 2 in this accident.
Until 2011's Fukushima Daiichi nuclear meltdown. Nowadays, in
terms of deaths, this one was worse. Unless you're lumping in the meltdown with the earthquake and tsunami that killed over 20,000 people. But I thought it just meant radiation deaths.
Aftermath of Chernobyl and Fukushima, which both left entire cities unfit for human life, nuclear...
Chernobyl, yes, though the exclusion zone supports human life now. Fukushima, though, not unfit for human life, and there have been studies if the evacuation ultimately caused more human harm than the accident. That sort of thing is difficult to measure because you're looking at people's stress levels and risk associated with that versus risk associated with above background radiation levels. I'm not going to say high radiation levels, especially in the context of the high radiation dose that was received by Uchi, but it's a trade-off you have to make when ordering an evacuation. I was taught that regularly as part of my emergency response classes, the risks of evacuation.
Power has a serious PR problem. The world of the future is no longer a purely nuclear one, as envisioned by our Cold War forebears. But does this potentially dangerous technology still have a place in our future?
I don't like the term potentially dangerous technology applied specifically to nuclear outside of context. You could argue everything's potentially dangerous. Solar is potentially dangerous because people can get electrocuted while performing maintenance on solar panels, or they could fall off of roofs and get seriously injured. Though I will say, when looked in aggregate, the safety record for nuclear is similar to that of solar and better than wind. And all of those are far better than coal and natural gas.
Likely, yes. For one, nuclear power accounts for at least 10% of the entire world's power generation. And is also the second largest source of low carbon power generation, second only to hydroelectric power generation.
It's also safer than hydro because hydro you can have dams break. It doesn't happen very often, and hydro is still very safe, but not as safe as nuclear. Just going off of OSHA at this point.
Japan relies on imports for approximately 80% of its energy consumption, and 90% of their crude oil imports come from the Middle East. So diversification of their energy generation was paramount. After the oil crisis of 1973 and 1979, Japan's energy sources included liquefied natural gas and coal, alongside nuclear generation. After 2011's Fukushima Daiichi nuclear disaster, the share of Japan's energy generation made up by nuclear power has dramatically decreased from a high of 30% in 2009 to a low of 0% in 2014.
And that's just sad, because that's sad. Can you imagine, due to a plane crash, grounding every flight permanently in the country? Or after an oil refinery explosion, deciding, which those happen way more often, deciding to never use oil and gas ever again.
In 2020, it increased to 5% of Japan's total energy production. It's also good to mention that nuclear power is pretty old technology by 2020 standards, and we've been developing safety procedures since the 1940s.
So safety procedures. So let's talk safety procedures. Additional safety margins, especially regarding criticality, were introduced in Japan and shared with the rest of the world after this particular accident. Standard operating procedures were revised to be more conservative. One bit is manual mixing of nuclear fuel solutions is banned. Automated systems handle fissile materials. Criticality, emergency response, radiation protection training were enhanced and required to be taken at least annually within the United States anyway. And of course, what I mentioned earlier about independent industry oversight committees, quality committees that is, to act in addition to the regulatory standards, which were also enhanced. And so many more, and there were several more, but those are just the highlights.
Safety systems only work if we use them. There will have to be some hard conversations.
Chernobyl turned off their safety systems, and look what happened.
In the future, considering the benefits and risks of nuclear power, not just in Japan.
This is broader than this isn't really a nuclear power thing. You could take this broader than nuclear power and just talk about following your own safety standard, whether it be radiation safety or electrical safety, arc flash and arc blast protection, for instance. Though I will say and it all comes down to treating a high energy, high potential system with the respect that it deserves. If they treated it with the respect that it deserves, no manual mixing, no procedure change, no deviation from said procedure change would have occurred. If we're going to change procedures, they're going to make them safer and let it run through its rigorous change control process.
But across the globe, many believe that nuclear power will cover enough of our energy needs to allow us to end our dependence on fossil fuels like natural gas, crude oil, and coal. But others believe that the risks of nuclear fission are too great, and we could spend our time and money on renewable energy like solar, wind, tidal, and geothermal power generation.
Those four things can help. They most certainly can, but we need to work with nuclear, not against it.
See, while nuclear energy may be low carbon, it's not renewable. It still requires the input of finite resources and the storage to irradiate waste. Though the amount of energy produced is far more efficient than coal or even gasoline.
Just because it's not renewable doesn't mean it's not going to last a long time. Also, that chart is skewed. That yellow bar needs to be about 10,000 times longer than that red bar for it to be close.
We may have our opinions about how Ouchi was treated, about whether or not his family should have let him pass earlier. But at the end of the day, I don't think many of us would be able to say for sure how we would feel were we in their position.
No, and I don't want to think about it. Thank you very much for watching. I'm going to go hold my wife and son.